A plaintive cry, fragile as spun glass, snagged on the Gothic architecture of St. Michael's. It insinuated itself into the cracks around the immense doors, a muted lament drowned by the susurrus of bare branches. Pressed against the church's threshold, a dog shivered, its ribs a washboard beneath ash-colored fur. Its tail, clamped tight, gave nervous little flutters. A torn ear, raw pink against ingrained dirt, marred its face. It fixed its gaze on the heavy portal, a silent expectation of deliverance shining in its damp eyes. Inside, Father Thomas, oblivious, softly mumbled, "Amazing Grace," doctoring thick rye slices with butter. The yeasty, caraway-laced scent permeated the kitchen, a warm shield against the encroaching November bite. Ham and cheese followed, piled high on each slice with a generous hand. Enough for himself, Mrs. Gable, his cleaning help, and, well, someone always needed sustenance. Waxed paper swaddled each creation, secured with humble twine. He paused, head cocked. Had something broken through his concentration? Just another gust, most likely. Coffee, thick and black, steamed before him, its heat a welcome kiss on his chilled cheeks. He peered out at the tidy garden, then the churchyard. There, headstones stood sentinel, guarding secrets whispered on the breeze. A familiar weight settled on him, the mantle of responsibility for St. Michael's. More than mere stone and mortar, it was the beating heart of this small place. A refuge, a place for joy, a memorial. And he, its appointed guardian, must tend to his flock, be they within these blessed walls or wandering lost in the shadowed wilderness. He recalled recently widowed Mr. Henderson, draped in a grief as tangible as any shroud. Young Sarah, struggling under the weight of 2 young ones. And the disquiet that seemed to be permeating the town, a subtle shift, a creeping darkness. He drained his cup, resolve firming his gaze. He would not yield to the encroaching shadows. He would remain a steadfast light in the gathering gloom. Snatching his tweed jacket from the rack, he made for the door. As his hand closed on the latch, it came again. A whisper of a whimper, barely audible. This time, he knew. It wasn't the wind's lament. He pulled the door open, a frigid blast announcing the sight of the shivering dog on the porch. Its gaze locked onto his, a desperate plea etched in every line of its small, battered form. Laughter in the park. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Oakhaven Park, painting the manicured lawns in hues of gold and amber. Father Thomas inhaled deeply, the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses filling his lungs. It was moments like these, stolen from the endless demands of the parish, that renewed his spirit. He ambled along the paved path, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the ancient oak trees that lined the way. Children's laughter echoed in the distance, a joyful counterpoint to the quiet contemplation he sought. He rounded a bend near the duck pond and the laughter sharpened, taking on a different quality. A knot tightened in his stomach. It wasn't the carefree sound of children playing, it was edged with something cruel. He quickened his pace, his sandals slapping softly against the pavement. Rounding the corner, the scene snapped into focus, confirming his apprehension. Ethan Bellwether, a regular at Sunday school until his recent rebellious phase, stood with 2 of his cronies, wiry, sneering figures with eyes that held a disturbing lack of empathy. Their attention was focused on Ben, the homeless man who often sought refuge under the park's bandstand. Ben was huddled on the ground, his tattered coat pulled tightly around him as if warding off more than just the chill. "Look at him," Ethan sneered, kicking a discarded soda can towards Ben. It bounced harmlessly off his leg. King of the trash heap. One of Ethan's friends, a boy with a shaved head and a silver chain dangling from his jeans, mimicked Ben's hunched posture, exaggerating his movements with a mocking limp. "Spare change, mister? Gotta get my fix." Ben didn't react, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement. His silence seemed only to embolden the teenagers. "Maybe we should build him a palace," the other boy, lanky and freckled, suggested, pulling a half-eaten sandwich from his backpack. "A cardboard kingdom, fit for a king." He tossed the sandwich at Ben, narrowly missing his head. Father Thomas felt a surge of anger, a righteous fire burning within him. He quickened his pace again, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn wooden cross he wore beneath his collar. The laughter escalated, a chorus of cruel amusement directed at the vulnerable man. Ben flinched, his shoulders rising as if expecting a blow. The priest's grip tightened on the cross. He had to intervene. This wasn't just a prank, it was a violation, a degradation of human dignity. He couldn't stand by and watch. A priest's resolve. The sight of Ben cowering on the park bench, his thin frame shaking against the biting wind, sent a jolt of anger through Father Thomas. It wasn't righteous anger, not at first. It was a raw, visceral fury at the callousness radiating from the gaggle of teenagers encircling him. Their laughter, sharp and cruel, cut through the afternoon quiet. He could hear snippets of their taunts: smelly, get a job, loser, each word a tiny poison dart aimed at Ben's already wounded spirit. He gripped the worn rosary beads in his pocket. The smooth would a small comfort against the turmoil rising within him. Compassion, a deep ache, followed the anger. He knew Ben. Knew his quiet dignity, the gentle way he always offered a mumbled "God bless" whenever Father Thomas gave him a spare dollar after Sunday service. To see him reduced to this, a spectacle of scorn, felt like a personal betrayal. Images flickered in his mind: Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the constant refrain to love thy neighbor as thyself. The words weren't just scripture, they were a living mandate, a call to action. He remembered reading them to his congregation only last Sunday, and now, faced with a tangible embodiment of their meaning, he couldn't simply stand by. He straightened his cassock, the simple act a grounding ritual. The air, crisp and carrying the scent of damp earth, filled his lungs. He could feel the weight of the cross around his neck, a reminder of sacrifice and unwavering commitment. The teenage voices rose in pitch, their mockery escalating. He started walking. Each step was deliberate, fueled by a growing resolve. He wasn't afraid, not exactly. More than fear, there was a profound sadness, a weariness at the casual cruelty people were capable of inflicting. As he drew closer, he could see the teenagers more clearly. Their faces, so young, were contorted with a disturbing mixture of boredom and malice. One boy, taller than the others, held up his phone, filming Ben. Father Thomas stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling across the group. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone was firm, cutting through their jeers like a blade. "That's enough." The laughter died down, replaced by an awkward silence. The teenagers turned, their faces a mixture of surprise and defiance. The boy with the phone hesitated, his thumb hovering over the record button. Father Thomas met his gaze, his own eyes unwavering. "Leave him alone," he said, the words a quiet but unbreakable command. Taunts and temptation. A frigid blast swirled off the church corner, carrying Ethan's jeering laughter like sonic shrapnel. Ben shrank further into his worn coat, his gaze flickering between his tormentors and the fractured flagstones underfoot. From the rectory, Father Thomas had observed the cruel display. Now he hurried out, his breath pluming in the frosty air. "Ethan, enough," he commanded, his voice firm despite a shiver that wasn't entirely from the cold. "Leave him be." Ethan, a broad-shouldered figure with a shaved head and a sneer permanently etched on his features, pivoted, his eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. "And what will you do, Padre? Recite a psalm? Offer us a sprinkle of your magic water?" Liam and Sarah, his acolytes, tittered, the sound bouncing off the aged brick. "I said stop, Ethan," Father Thomas pressed, closing the distance between them. The stench of stale beer and cheap tobacco wafted from the trio. "He needs kindness, not your malice." Liam nudged Ben's leg with his boot. Maybe if he bothered to work instead of begging, he wouldn't need anything. Sarah, her tone laced with acid, chimed in, "Yes, Father. Perhaps you should teach him self-reliance. Although, I notice he lacks the boots for the task." Ethan advanced on Father Thomas, violating his space. "So, Father, still clinging to your fantasies? Still believing in some mythical savior in the sky?" He punctuated his words with a jab to the priest's chest, his finger digging into his sternum. Father Thomas held his ground, refusing to yield. "Faith isn't a delusion, Ethan. It's about empathy, about aiding those less fortunate." "Empathy." Ethan spat near Father Thomas's worn shoes. "That's what landed this bum where he is. Compassion is dead in this world, Padre. It's survival of the fittest. And you consider that something to celebrate?" Father Thomas countered, his voice tinged with disappointment. Ethan shrugged, indifferent. It's reality. You're the one lost in dreams, Father. A land of guilt and sacrifice. Why deny yourself pleasure? Why not seize what you want? Look at your life, celibate, impoverished. What's the point? He gestured expansively at the church, a shadow against the cold twilight. All this, for what? Empty benches and decaying relics? You could be enjoying life, Father. Really living. He offered a lascivious wink. Sarah snickered, nudging Liam with her elbow. The air thrummed with unspoken threats and simmering disdain. Father Thomas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. This was no longer simply about Ben. It was about something profound, something sinister. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down, an attempt to erode his very soul. A simple act of kindness. The taunts ricocheted off Father Thomas, harmless as rain against a fortress. "Hey, Holy Joe, think you can wash away the Skid Row stink?" a youth jeered, flicking ash in Ben's direction. Unwavering, Thomas kept his gaze fixed on the figure slumped against the wall. Ben remained downcast, his sight glued to the cracked concrete. The air reeked of cheap lager and exhaust. He was accustomed to anonymity, a shadow flitting through the city's vibrant veins. Yet, this felt distinct, almost ordained. Father Thomas descended, the rustle of his cassock soft against the gritty ground. He offered a plain brown package. A sandwich, ham and cheese. And some water. "Would you care for them?" Ben's head jerked up, his weary, bloodshot eyes widening in surprise. He'd braced for scorn, a shove, the indifference he knew so well. This was unexpected. He studied the offering, then the priest, seeking a hidden agenda. He found only honest empathy mirrored in the man's features. I have no way to repay you," Ben rasped, his voice like gravel. Thomas smiled, lines radiating from his eyes like sunbeams. "Consider it a gesture of goodwill. From one human being to another." He set the bag and bottle near Ben's hand. The cool plastic was a stark contrast to his skin. The teenagers, briefly disarmed, began to murmur amongst themselves. The ringleader, emboldened by his peers, edged closer. "Hey, Padre, don't you realize he'll just squander that on rotgut?" Finally, Thomas turned to face them. His voice, though quiet, resonated with an inner strength. "That is a matter between him and his Maker." He met their eyes, holding each gaze until, one by one, they broke contact, scuffing their shoes on the sidewalk. Ben, still reeling, tentatively reached for the sandwich. The simple scent of ham and cheese was a fragrant balm to his senses. With trembling fingers, he unwrapped it. The stale bread and common filling tasted like grace itself. He looked up at Father Thomas, his eyes glistening with a feeling dormant for years, hope. "Thank you," he choked out, the words thick with emotion. More than sustenance, it was a lifeline. A stark reminder that even in the deepest shadows, compassion could still blossom. Ben's story. The bravado the teenagers had displayed earlier evaporated with the setting sun. Their taunts had grown weaker, their jeers less frequent, until finally they stood in awkward silence. Even their leader, the one with the shaved head and sneering lip, seemed deflated. He kicked at a loose stone, sending it skittering across the pavement. "Whatever," he muttered, the word hanging in the air like a surrender flag. He shoved his hands into his pockets and turned, the others shuffling after him like a disbanded army. Father Thomas watched them go, a knot of disappointment tightening in his stomach. He'd hoped for a breakthrough, a moment of understanding. Perhaps that would come later. He turned back to Ben, who was still huddled against the brick wall, watching the retreating figures with wary eyes. "They're gone now, Ben. They won't bother you any more tonight." Ben didn't respond, but his shoulders seemed to relax slightly. Father Thomas knelt beside him, offering the bag. "I brought you some food and water. It's not much, but—" Ben's eyes, bloodshot and weary, flickered to the bag. A tremor ran through his hand as he reached for it. He pulled out a sandwich, tearing at the plastic wrapper with trembling fingers. He ate with a desperate hunger, each bite devoured as if it might be his last. He followed the sandwich with long gulps of water, the bottle rattling against his chapped lips. When he was finished, he looked at Father Thomas, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, Father." His voice was raspy, barely a whisper. Father Thomas smiled gently. "You're welcome, Ben. Is there anything else I can do?" Ben hesitated, then sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. Maybe you could just listen." Father Thomas nodded, settling back against the wall. The air had grown cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant rumble of traffic. "I lost my job," Ben began, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement. "Worked at the foundry for 20 years. Then they shut it down, moved everything overseas. Said I was too old to retrain for the new equipment." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Too old. I was 52. He paused, swallowing hard. "Couldn't find anything else. Bills piled up. Missed a few mortgage payments. Then a foreclosure. Lost everything. The house, the car, everything." He scrubbed a hand across his face, leaving a streak of grime on his forehead. "My wife, she left. Said she couldn't handle it. Can't say I blame her. Seeing me like that." He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. Father Thomas remained silent, offering only his presence, a silent promise of understanding. "Been living on the streets ever since. A few months now. It's harder than you think, Father. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness. But worst of all is the shame. The way people look at you. Like you're not even human anymore." He looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored the suffering Christ on the cross. "I used to be someone, Father. I used to have a life. A safe haven." Father Thomas squeezed Ben's shoulder, a silent reassurance. "Come," he murmured, his voice a comforting bass note against the keen of the wind. "Let's find you sanctuary." He steered Ben around the church's flank, fumbling with keys to a stout oak door leading into a long, shadowy room. Inside, the air hung still and redolent of aged wood and a delicate, floral undercurrent, likely lavender sachets warding off moths. A row of cots lined the walls, each neatly made with a folded blanket and pillow. The stark bulb above painted elongated shadows, highlighting the room's Spartan functionality, yet radiating a sense of refuge. "We use this as an emergency shelter," Father Thomas explained, his breath blooming in the chill. "It's humble, but dry and sheltered. You can rest here tonight." Ben's wide eyes scanned the space, a fragile mix of hope and incredulity flickering within. I don't know what to say." The priest simply offered a steady, empathetic gaze. "Say nothing. Just rest. I'll bring you some warm broth and bread shortly." He indicated a cot. "Choose one." As Ben sank onto the bed, the scratchy wool of the blanket a novel sensation against his skin, Father Thomas settled onto a shaky chair beside him. "This is a stopgap, Ben. We need to find something more lasting." Extracting a dog-eared notepad and pen, he inquired, "Do you have family? Friends we might reach?" Ben shook his head, a barely perceptible tremor. "No one." The solitary word reverberated in the silent space. Father Thomas made a note. "All right. We'll navigate this. Resources exist, shelters, vocational programs. Connecting you is the key." He tapped the pen against the pad, lost in thought. "I'll make some calls in the morning. See what's available." A pause, then his expression softened. "Meanwhile, try to sleep. You're safe now." Later, after Ben had consumed the simple, sustaining soup, Father Thomas lingered in the silent sanctuary, the stained glass windows splashing kaleidoscopic colors across the floor. He knelt at the altar, not in formal supplication, but in quiet consideration. Ben's hollowed face, the haunted depths of his eyes, lingered in his thoughts. Rising, a steadfast determination took root. He couldn't shoulder this burden alone. He moved to the sacristy and retrieved a small, locked strongbox. Unlocking it, he withdrew a sheet of pristine paper and a pen. He began composing an announcement for Sunday's sermon. He would speak of empathy, of shared accountability, of the Church's sacred pledge to protect the vulnerable. He would galvanize a collection, not merely of funds, but of garments, covers, and shelf-stable provisions. He would ensure Ben received more than merely a temporary bed in a bleak room. He would extend a lifting hand, a chance to recover his life. The Church, Father Thomas contemplated, his spirit brimming with intention, would be a genuine sanctuary. Community of compassion. Sunlight, fragmented by St. Michael's kaleidoscopic windows, splashed the parishioners with shifting colors on Sunday morning. Father Thomas, his voice a warm baritone, addressed them from the lectern. "Brothers and sisters," he said, his gaze encompassing the congregation, "as you are aware, we welcome a new member, Ben, who currently lacks a permanent address." Ethan, seated beside his mother, squirmed. He'd anticipated the announcement, yet hearing it resonate within those familiar walls struck a discordant note. A ripple of hushed voices spread through the pews. "Ben is one of God's children, just as we all are, and deserves our empathy and aid." The priest's appeal continued. "I am therefore requesting your assistance. We will be collecting donations throughout the week: clothing, staples, blankets, personal care items, anything to alleviate his hardship and help him regain stability." The response was immediate. The parish hall hummed with activity after the service. Mrs. Henderson, known for her pristine garden and equally stringent budget, presented a brimming bag of tinned goods. Mr. O'Malley, the retired woodworker, carried a carefully folded pile of thick woolen blankets. Even the teenagers, typically absorbed by their devices, unearthed forgotten jackets and jeans from family closets. Ethan observed the scene, a disquieting feeling churning within him. He witnessed the genuine concern etched on faces, the eagerness to assist. He saw Mrs. Davies, whose son had battled addiction, tucking a handwritten note of encouragement into the donated garments. He saw those unostentatious acts of kindness, a vibrant portrait of a community uniting behind someone in need. Sensing his unease, his mother touched his arm gently. "It's right, Ethan," she murmured, her eyes full of kindness. "It's what we are asked to do." He nodded, yet internally, a conflict raged. He understood, intellectually, the morality of their actions. He recognized the goodness in these people, their sincere wish to lessen Ben's suffering. But the memory of Ben, scruffy and crestfallen, ridiculed by him and his companions, weighed heavily on his conscience. He thought of the crumpled $5 bill still lodged in his wallet, intended for a new game. It felt tainted now, marked by his own transgression. He yearned to contribute, to participate in this wave of compassion, but the idea felt shallow, inadequate. He hadn't earned the privilege. He saw Father Thomas, his face alight with gratitude, accepting a bag of winter coats from the Gonzalez family. The priest's eyes met Ethan's, and he offered a kind smile. Ethan averted his gaze, shame stinging his cheeks. He understood he couldn't hide forever. The community was emulating Christ's teachings, but could he confront Ben, seek forgiveness, and atone for his cruelty? He had serious introspection ahead. A wagging tail, a changed heart. The hot water had stung at first, shocking his skin awake after weeks of grime and cold. Now, wrapped in a borrowed, oversized robe that smelled faintly of lavender, Ben felt almost human. He sat at the small, scarred table in Father Thomas's kitchen, a bowl of steaming stew warming his hands. The savory aroma filled the room, chasing away the last vestiges of the alleyway stench. "Thank you, Father," Ben said, his voice still raspy but stronger than it had been. He took a tentative spoonful of the stew, his eyes widening. "This is amazing." Father Thomas chuckled, his lined face crinkling at the corners. "My secret recipe. Mostly vegetables I pilfered from Mrs. Henderson's garden. She won't miss a few carrots." Ben managed a weak smile. He ate slowly, savoring each mouthful. It was the first time in a long time he hadn't felt the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. When he finally finished, he leaned back, a sigh escaping his lips. "I don't know how to repay you," he said, meeting the priest's kind gaze. "Repay me by getting back on your feet, Ben. That's all the repayment I need." Father Thomas reached across the table and placed a work-roughened hand on Ben's arm. "We all stumble. The important thing is to find the strength to rise again." Ben nodded, his throat tightening. He hadn't felt this seen, this cared for, in years. A sudden bark from outside the kitchen window made him jump. It was the scruffy terrier mix, the one he'd seen Ethan and his friends tormenting a lifetime ago, or so it felt. The dog sat patiently on the small patch of lawn, its tail thumping a hopeful rhythm against the grass. Ben stared, transfixed. The dog tilted its head, its brown eyes bright and intelligent. Then, slowly, deliberately, it wagged its tail a little harder, its gaze fixed on Ben. It was a tentative, almost hesitant wag, but it was there. A flicker of recognition? Or perhaps just a shared understanding of hardship and hope. Father Thomas followed Ben's gaze. He watched the dog, then back at Ben, a knowing smile gracing his lips. He understood the unspoken connection, the silent language of suffering and resilience. "He seems to like you, Ben," Father Thomas said softly. Ben swallowed, his heart aching with a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. He hadn't been able to help the dog that day. He had been too weak, too consumed by his own survival. But now, perhaps, things could be different. Perhaps he could be different. He pushed back his chair and walked to the window, opening it a crack. The dog whined softly and took a tentative step closer. Ben reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly. "Hey there," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Hey, buddy." The dog nudged its wet nose against his fingertips, its tail now wagging with unrestrained joy. Father Thomas watched from the kitchen table, his heart swelling with a quiet satisfaction. He had offered a lifeline, and Ben had grabbed it. And in that small act of kindness, he saw not only Ben's redemption, but perhaps a glimmer of hope for Ethan as well. The world was full of stray souls, lost and hurting. Sometimes, all it took was a little compassion, a little faith, to bring them home.